On a Monday morning in March, a burnt-out Aston Martin sat at the center of an Albany auction floor frame, twisted cabin reduced to ash identification plate, melted beyond any reading opening at $200. 72 collectors were in that room. Not one raised a hand. They walked past it the way people walk past something already dead. Only one man stopped. 29 years old, flannel shirt rolled to the elbows over a thermal undershirt, dark skin weathered by garage work and outdoor winters, close-cropped hair beginning to show the faintest silver at the temple's engine grease still embedded in the creases of his hands from a job left at 5 o'clock in the morning to drive 3 hours to reach this room. He stood in front of that wreck for exactly 15 seconds and said nothing. Then he raised his hand. You will not believe what he saw inside that wreck that 72 experts had already turned their backs on. The Sterling Prestige Auctions building on the eastern edge of Albany was the kind of place designed to make certain people feel comfortable and everyone else feel out of place. The floors were polished concrete sealed to a mirror shine. The lighting was the warm amber of expensive hotel lobbies, and the chairs arranged in rows for the morning session were the sort of padded folding chairs that cost more per unit than most people spent on a work week of lunches. Margaret Sterling moved through the space the way she always did, unhurried, precisely dressed in a charcoal blazer over slate-wool trousers, a single thin ring on her right hand, her dark hair pulled back with the kind of effortless neatness that takes years of practice. She had been running Sterling Prestige for 11 years. She knew her room. She knew her buyers. And when the catalog reached Lot 47, the burnt Aston Martin retrieved from an Ohio warehouse liquidation, she already knew it was a cleanup item, the kind of lump of liability you moved fast and forgot faster. Her appraiser, Gregory Holcomb, had looked at photographs 3 weeks prior and delivered his verdict without ever leaving his office. A 1967 DB6 severe fire damage, no recoverable value sell for scrap weight, and closed the file. Margaret had set the opening at $200, not because she thought anyone would compete, but because the paperwork required a number. Lawrence Whitmore, seated in the third row with his Navy suit and his Patek Philippe and his 30 years of collecting European road cars, had leaned toward his assistant when the lot was wheeled out and said in a voice low enough to pass for quiet that it was nothing but scorched iron and he wouldn't pay a mechanic to haul it away. The room agreed by saying nothing at all. Darius Bell had driven to Albany from his shop on the south end of the city, a one-bay garage that sat behind a decommissioned gas station on a street that development money had not yet reached. He had been awake since 2:30 in the morning the night before browsing the auction catalog on a cracked tablet propped against his toolbox. He had almost scrolled past Lot 47 the way everyone else would later walk past the car itself, but something stopped him. The photograph was poor underexposed, taken at an angle that compressed the car's dimensions, but Darius had grown up learning to read cars the way other children learn to read words. His father, Walter Bell, had emigrated from Mississippi to England in his early 20s chasing work, and ended up on the paint line at the Aston Martin factory in Newport Pagnell, the only black man on his shift for the better part of 2 decades, and he had taken a young Darius through the production floor on Saturdays and taught him to identify models by proportion alone, by the angle of a roofline, by the relationship between wheelbase and body width. Walter used to say that being the only one in any room meant you had to see twice as carefully because the room would always assume you saw less. Standing in front of the catalog photo at 2 o'clock in the morning, Darius noticed something that should not have been there. The A-pillar. The structural column at the front corner of the roof leaned back at an angle steeper than any DB6 he had ever seen. The wheelbase, even compressed by bad photography, looked shorter. He opened a text to Arthur Whitfield, his father's old colleague at Newport Pagnell, a 69-year-old retired craftsman who had spent 40 years shaping aluminum panels by hand at the factory, and who had been the one to hand Walter a sandwich on his first lunch break when no one else had spoken to him. He typed, "Did you ever work on the Zagato cars?" Arthur replied at 3 o'clock in the morning, as if he had not been asleep either. "My hands shaped 8 of the 19. Why? Darius did not answer. He put Imani's coat by the door for the morning, set his alarm for 4:30, and lay in the dark with his eyes open. Imani had been 6 years old since October, and had developed the habit of asking questions that landed with more weight than she knew. Her hair he had braided himself the night before, in 2 careful rows down to the nape of her neck, the way her mother had taught him in the last months, before she got sick, the small plastic beads at the ends clicking softly whenever she turned her head. When Darius buckled her into the back seat at 5:15 that morning, her stuffed rabbit, a gray cotton animal her mother had bought the week before she died 3 years ago, now tucked under one arm, she looked up at him with the matter-of-fact directness that children use before the world teaches them to soften things, and asked what they were going to buy. Darius told her he wasn't sure yet. "Maybe nothing," he said. "Maybe everything." She considered this for a moment, accepted it the way she accepted most of his answers, and fell asleep against the window before they reached the highway. Darius drove in silence, both hands on the wheel, the heater running against the March cold, the catalog photos still open in his memory. He had worked 4 years in Aston Martin's Heritage Restoration Division before moving to America. 4 years spent in a room with 9 people whose entire purpose was to recover, verify, and restore the oldest surviving examples of the marca's history. He had learned in that room that the most dangerous thing a person could carry into a judgment was the assumption that they already knew what they were looking at. He had also learned something simpler and harder to teach: that original aluminum hand-shaped and hand-finished carried a frequency of surface detail that stamped metal simply could not replicate. It felt different. It sounded different when you tapped it. And under the right light, it looked different. Not glamorous, not perfect, but unmistakably, irreversibly human. When the lot was wheeled into the light, and Margaret Sterling read the description, and the room stayed silent, and the seconds stretched out, and nobody moved, Darius raised his hand. He felt the brief sweep of attention pass across him, the kind of glance he had learned to recognize since he was a boy. The quick assessment of a room registering an unfamiliar presence and deciding what to make of it. He had stopped letting that glance change anything he did a long time ago. He paid $200. He signed the receipt at a side table while Margaret watched from the edge of the room, noting his flannel shirt and his truck visible through the glass doors and the child in the back seat pressing her face to the window. She did not say anything to him. She returned to the podium for Lot 48, which was a 1973 Ferrari Dino, and considerably more interesting to everyone present. The burnt shell was loaded onto a flatbed trailer that Tyler Brennan had backed up to the service entrance, and Darius drove south through the gray mid-morning with the thing he had just bought rattling gently behind him. Imani awake now and asking if the car was sad. Darius told her it had been waiting a long time. He said sometimes things waited longer than they should. There is a particular kind of looking that the world rewards, and a particular kind of looking that the world does not. The first kind is fast and confident and produces verdicts. The second kind is slow and uncertain and produces questions. The room in Albany that morning had been full of the first kind. What nobody noticed, because nobody was watching for it, was that the second kind tends to belong most often to people who have spent their lives being looked at the first way themselves, who have learned by long necessity that the surface of a thing and the truth of a thing are not the same, and that the difference between them is where almost everything important lives. Imani pressed her rabbit against the window glass and looked back at the blackened shape on the trailer, and said nothing more for the rest of the drive. The garage on the south end had fluorescent lights that Darius had replaced 2 years ago with 5,000 Kelvin halogen panels, not for atmosphere but for accuracy. The kind of light that showed metal surfaces the way they actually were, not the way the eye wanted them to be. He pushed the car into the center of the bay on a rolling dolly, positioned it under the lamps, and then did something that Tyler found difficult to watch. He sat down on an overturned bucket 4 feet away and simply looked at it for 5 full minutes without touching anything. Tyler stood near the wall with his arms crossed the way he always stood when Darius was reading something he didn't yet understand. He had known Darius since they were both 22 and working at different shops across town, and he had learned over those years that Darius's silences were not the silences of uncertainty. They were the silences of someone moving through a systematic interior process that would eventually produce a conclusion Tyler had not anticipated. Imani came in from the apartment above the shop with her homework folder and a juice box, the beads in her braids clicking faintly as she walked, and settled herself at the workbench with a pencil. And the garage was quiet except for the low hum of the heating unit and the sound of a 6-year-old working through her multiplication tables. Then Darius stood up, pulled on a pair of cotton gloves, and began. What he found in the next 3 hours dismantled every assumption the room at Sterling Prestige Auctions had carried away with them that morning. The first thing he measured was the wheelbase, the distance between the front and rear axle center lines using a steel tape rule and a piece of chalk. The number he got was 2,362 millimeters. He measured it twice. A 1967 DB6 had a wheelbase of 2,490 millimeters. The difference was not the product of fire damage or structural deformation. The frame was intact. The number was the original number. It belonged to a shorter car. Specifically, it belonged to the DB4 Aston Martin's earlier platform, built between 1958 and 1963. He then took a single blade scraper and removed a small section of ash from the rear quarter panel, working in a 3-inch square, going slowly. What appeared beneath the ash was hand-formed aluminum bearing the minute, evenly spaced dimple marks that indicated it had been shaped over a rounded form by a craftsman working a hammer in a rhythm so practiced it left a surface that looked machine-perfect from 3 feet away and entirely beautifully handmade from 3 inches. He crouched at the front corner and studied the A-pillar in profile. It swept rearward at an angle no DB6 had ever used. It was the angle of the Zagato coachwork the body style commissioned in very limited numbers from the Milanese coach builder Carrozzeria Zagato, applied to the DB4 GT platform for a handful of customers who wanted something lighter and stranger and faster than anything the standard catalog offered. He crawled under the car with a flashlight. The frame was a small section steel tube construction, not the wider pressed steel ladder of the DB6, but the narrow, elegant lattice of the original DB4 GT chassis. He came back out and stood very still for a moment. Then he moved to the firewall, the steel partition between the engine compartment and the cabin, and began removing carbon deposits with a fine brass brush, working in small circles, patient and methodical, until the brush found the edge of stamped characters pressed into the steel itself. He worked for 40 minutes. When he stepped back, what was visible on the firewall, partially obscured but legible to anyone who knew what they were looking for, was a sequence DB4/GT/0180/LA, the chassis designation, the build specification, and the number 0180. 19 Aston Martin DB4 GT Zagatos were made between 1960 and 1963. Number 0180 was the designation of a car that had been documented at a racing event in 1962 and had not appeared in any verified registry since 1974. For 50 years, every person in the Aston Martin collector world who cared about such things had assumed it was either destroyed or buried so deep in private hands that it might as well be. Nobody had stopped to consider that it might be sitting in a warehouse in Ohio, wearing 50 years of anonymity and 3 years of fire damage, waiting for someone to measure its wheelbase with a steel tape. Darius called Arthur Whitfield at 11 o'clock that night. In Coventry, it was 4 o'clock in the morning. Arthur picked up on the second ring. Darius said, "Do you remember chassis 0180? There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for Darius to check that the call was still connected. Then he heard the old man breathe out slowly, the particular exhale of someone setting something down that they had been carrying for a long time, and say very quietly, "God Almighty." The thing about expertise that nobody likes to admit is that it can become a kind of blindness. The 72 people in that auction room were not stupid. Several of them had forgotten more about European sports cars than most people will ever know. But knowledge, when it hardens into certainty, stops being a tool for seeing and becomes a tool for not having to look. They had read the catalog description. The catalog said DB6 fire damage, no recoverable value. And so that is what their eyes told them they were seeing. It is worth noticing gently that the person who saw the truth was someone who had been taught by his father and by his life that the official description of a thing was not necessarily the whole of the thing. There is a small piece of wisdom buried in this easy to miss. If you have ever felt that the world was quick to decide what you were before you had finished becoming it, you already know the discipline of looking longer than the room around you is willing to. That same discipline applied to anything else, including an aluminum panel under 50 years of soot, will eventually find what others have missed. The next 5 days were the kind of work that Darius had been trained for and had not done at this scale since leaving Newport Pagnell. He started at 5 o'clock every morning and finished when Imani fell asleep in the corner of the garage on a folding cot he had set up for exactly this purpose. Her rabbit on her chest, her homework done in pencil on the workbench. He had figured out in the 3 years since his wife died that the trick to single fatherhood was not to try to separate work from parenting, but to braid them together until Imani could not remember a time when she had not been welcome wherever he was. The disassembly was conservative. He was not rebuilding the car. He was uncovering it the way an archaeologist removes soil rather than excavates it. He used compressed air at low pressure, natural bristle brushes, and a proprietary aluminum safe cleaning agent he had brought back from England 6 years ago and rationed carefully since. He did not use paint stripper. He did not use acids. He did not use anything that would alter or consume the surface record of the metal itself. He worked with the same deliberate quietness he used for everything that mattered. And when Tyler arrived in the mornings, he found the garage already lit and Darius already crouched beside the car in the circle of a single work lamp, moving the brush in careful arcs no wider than his hand. Day by day, the car's actual shape emerged from the ash. The rear quarters, which had been protected from the worst of the engine compartment fire by the bulk of the cabin structure, came out in exceptional condition. The aluminum surface clean, the hand dimpling clearly visible, the Zagato-specific contour of the rear haunches unmistakable once the obscuring soot was removed. The hood was a more difficult story. The fire had started somewhere beneath it, and the heat had been most concentrated there, but even the distorted panels held in their underlying structure the evidence Darius needed. He was not looking for perfection. He was looking for origin. The engine block itself was beyond recovery, fused and cracked by extreme heat, but Darius did not need the engine to establish the car's identity. On the second day, while documenting the block before setting it aside, he found 2 digits still legible on the casting in a protected recess. 8 and 0, consistent with the last 2 characters of chassis 0180. He photographed them from 4 angles and said nothing to Tyler, who was watching, until he had done the math twice in his head and was certain the position of the digits on the casting matched the Newport Pagnell numbering convention for the DB4 GT series. On the 3rd day, he conducted a video call with Arthur Whitfield, holding his phone camera to every surface detail the old man asked to see. Arthur directed him with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for and why. He asked Darius to go to the rear door sill on the passenger side and find the trailing edge. Arthur directed him to a specific raised contour there, a slight outward curve subtle enough that a person who did not know it was there would not notice it, distinctive enough that the person who put it there would recognize it for the rest of life. It served no aerodynamic or structural purpose. It existed because the craftsman who had beaten that panel into shape on a particular afternoon in 1961 had made a fraction of a millimeter decision with his hammer at the end of a long day, a small improvised adjustment that had become, by the time the panel was fitted, simply part of the car. Arthur said in a voice that had gone very quiet, "I put that there. My thumb was blistered that week from the day before." I remember because I thought about it every time I gripped the hammer for the next 3 days. Darius asked him if he was certain. Arthur said he was 69 years old, and his memory of his own hands was the one thing he had not lost. On the 5th day, Darius finished cleaning the firewall and confirmed the full chassis marking. That same night, he composed an email to Catherine Holloway, the director of the Aston Martin Heritage Trust at Newport Pagnell, attaching 47 photographs and a written account of every measurement material analysis and identifying detail he had documented over 5 days and 4 nights. He sent it at 2:14 in the morning. He then sat on the concrete floor of his garage next to the slowly revealed body of the most significant surviving Aston Martin in the world and ate a sandwich and thought about his father. He thought about the photograph he still kept above his workbench, Walter Bell in factory coveralls at age 31, standing in front of a paint booth in Newport Pagnell, the only dark face in a row of 9 smiling, not because he was happy in any complete sense, but because he had decided at some point that morning that he was going to be exactly where he was. Darius had not understood that smile when he was a boy. He understood it now. The first hour of any honest work is almost always the loneliest. The room has not yet caught up with what you are doing. The result is not yet visible. There is only you and the thing in front of you, and the quiet act of paying attention to something the world has agreed is not worth attention. If you happen to be in such an hour yourself, in whatever shape it has taken for you, the small encouragement worth holding on to is that the people who eventually change what a thing is understood to be are almost never the people who were granted permission to do so. They are the people who started before permission arrived and kept going. Between day 5 and day 10, Darius also had to manage the paper. On the morning of day 6, a letter arrived from the legal office representing Sterling Prestige Auctions. Formal, letterhead, careful language, the tone of a document written to establish a position without quite stating it directly. The substance was this: the lot had been sold under terms described as is no provenance guaranteed, and if the vehicle turned out to carry a materially different identity than the one described in the catalog. Sterling Prestige reserved the right to request a review of the transaction terms. The letter did not say the word fraud. It did not need to. Darius read it twice, put it in the drawer beneath his workbench, and went back to cleaning aluminum. On day 8, a second letter arrived from a different firm representing Lawrence Whitmore, raising questions about information asymmetry at the time of bidding. Darius read it once, added it to the drawer with the first, and said nothing to anyone except Tyler, who suggested he call someone with a law degree. Darius said the car was the answer to both letters, and that he preferred to let the car do the talking. The logic was correct. He had paid the asking price under the same terms available to every person in that room. He had not come into possession of any information that was withheld from the other bidders. He had simply read what was there to be read by anyone willing to look. By the time Catherine Holloway's reply arrived 6 days later, the situation had already begun to move in ways that Darius had not entirely controlled. Tyler Brennan, who had been present for most of the work and who had a phone camera and a tendency toward documentation that Darius tolerated because Tyler was otherwise irreplaceable, had posted a 6-second clip with no caption, just the image of the car under the halogen lights after cleaning. The aluminum body glowing softly gold, the Zagato silhouette unmistakable to anyone who knew it. He had not identified the car. He had not said anything at all. Within 6 hours, it had been seen 2 million times, shared extensively in collector communities, and identified by at least 4 separate Aston Martin specialists who left urgent and increasingly frantic messages for Darius's shop line, which Darius did not return. The noise also reached Margaret Sterling through a broker named Jonathan Webb, who called her at her desk and asked in a tone carefully calibrated to sound casual whether she had any concern about the handling of Lot 47. Margaret told him the sale was complete under standard terms and that she had no concerns. After she hung up, she looked at the photograph on her screen for a long time. She had Gregory Holcomb's assessment in her files. DB6 fire damage. No recoverable value. She had trusted that assessment because she had trusted Gregory Holcomb for 15 years. She had not gone to the warehouse in Ohio herself. She had 9 other lots to manage that quarter, and the burnt car had seemed like the least of them. The silence she held after looking at that photograph was the particular silence of someone who has begun to understand the full geometry of what they got wrong. Lawrence Whitmore arrived at Darius's shop on the afternoon of the 6th day alone, except for his driver wearing a black overcoat and moving with the smooth, effortless authority of a man who had rarely in his adult life encountered a situation that money could not resolve. He stood just inside the garage door and looked at the car for 30 seconds, long enough for Darius to observe that this was not the dismissive glance he had given it in Albany, but something more careful, more reluctant. Then he said he was prepared to offer $50,000, no verification required transaction completed that afternoon. Darius was holding a piece of aluminum cleaning cloth and did not put it down. He said the car was not for sale. Lawrence Whitmore raised the offer to $100,000. Darius said the same thing. Lawrence looked around the garage, the single bay, the cracked floor drained, the folding cot in the corner with a child-stuffed rabbit on it, and said $100,000 was a serious number for a shop like this. Darius turned and looked at him with the kind of steadiness that is harder to maintain than anger, and said that Lawrence had stood 3 feet from this car in Albany and decided it was worth nothing, and that the decision had been made, and the transaction had been completed, and that he was welcome to leave. Lawrence Whitmore was not accustomed to being dismissed by men in flannel shirts in single-bay garages, but he had enough experience with a certain quality of refusal to recognize that this particular one was not negotiable. He left. Imani, who had been watching from the apartment stairs with her rabbit, asked her father who the man was. Darius said he was someone who had learned too late to look more carefully. Imani nodded, as though this explained everything, which in a sense it did. Catherine Halloway arrived on the 9th day with 2 assistants, a portable spectrographic analysis unit, and a set of original build drawings that had been in the Newport Pagnell archives since 1961. She worked for 4 hours and 20 minutes without speaking to Darius except to ask him to hold a light source at specific angles and to confirm certain measurements. Her 2 assistants photographed everything. Darius sat on his overturned bucket and watched and did not ask questions. When Catherine Halloway finally removed her gloves and stood up straight and looked at him, her expression was the controlled professional face of someone managing a very large amount of information at once. She told him she understood what this meant. She told him she needed 48 hours to complete the documentation. She told him not to make any public statements. Darius said he hadn't made any so far. She said she was aware of that and that it was one of the reasons she was here. She left with her assistants and her equipment, and the garage felt very quiet after they went. Tyler, who had been sitting on a stool in the corner with his arms crossed for the entire 4 hours, exhaled slowly and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Darius." And Darius said, "I know." Imani came down from the apartment with 2 mugs of instant cocoa, 1 for each of them, and set them on the workbench and went back upstairs to watch television. Tyler picked up his mug and looked at the car and shook his head slowly in the way people do when they have run out of words for a thing. On the morning of the 10th day, Arthur Whitfield arrived at Albany International Airport on a one-way ticket from Birmingham, England, pushing a small rolling bag through the arrivals gate with the slow deliberateness of a man in his late 60s for whom airports had never become comfortable. Darius had not asked him to come. Nobody had. The old man had simply booked the flight 2 days after their video call without announcement and sent a single text that read only, "I'm coming to see it." Darius stood in the arrivals area and watched him come through the glass doors and thought about how the person who had shaped the panels on this car 63 years ago had now flown across the Atlantic at his own expense without invitation, because the idea that he might not see the car again with his own eyes was apparently not something he was prepared to accept. Arthur shook Darius's hand, the way men of his generation shook hands, both hands briefly held, and then put his palm gently on the back of Darius's neck for half a second, the way he had once done with Walter Bell at the end of a long shift, and asked if the copper was still in good shape. Darius told him it was. Arthur said good, and picked up his bag, and that was the sum total of the sentiment either of them expressed about the situation for the rest of the drive back to Albany. Margaret Sterling came to the garage on the 13th day, and she came alone, without a lawyer, without an assistant. Without the structured authority of the auction house framing her presence, she parked a dark gray sedan on the street and walked in and stood near the entrance and looked at the car for a long time without speaking. The aluminum body was now fully cleaned. The Zagato coachwork, visible in its entirety, the low roofline, the wide rear haunches, the compressed tail, the particular elegance of a hand-formed body that had been designed not to be beautiful in a conventional way, but to be fast and had ended up being both. Margaret looked at it with an expression that Darius recognized. Not as grief exactly, but as the specific private experience of understanding a mistake in its full dimension. She said eventually that she had sold it to him for $200. Darius said yes. She asked if there was anything, and she did not complete the sentence. Darius said there was nothing. He said the transaction was complete and she could go. She stood for another moment. She was not a person who had cultivated the habit of apology, and it showed in the way she held her posture even now. But there was something in the quality of her stillness that was different from the authority she had moved through the world with on the morning of the auction. She turned and walked back to her car. Imani, watching from the corner of the garage, asked her father if the woman was unhappy. Darius considered the question and told her there was a difference between being unhappy and being sorry, and that what the woman was feeling was probably the second thing. Imani thought about this for a moment and then went back to her drawing. There is something worth pausing on in the way Darius handled both Lawrence Whitmore and Margaret Sterling. He did not gloat. He did not raise his voice. He did not make either of them say out loud what they had clearly already begun to say to themselves. The kind of dignity he had inherited from his father was not the kind that needed an opponent to lose loudly in order to feel that it had won. It was the kind that understood that the most expensive thing you can do when someone has misjudged you is to refuse to let their misjudgment determine your behavior in return. Most of us, when we are finally proved right, want to be proved right out loud. The harder and rarer thing is to be proved right quietly and to let the silence do its own work. It is a small thing to notice, but it is the kind of small thing that, practiced over a lifetime, changes the shape of who someone becomes. Catherine Holloway's certification arrived by email on the 11th day, 2 days after her visit. The subject line read, Aston Martin Heritage Trust Authentication Certificate. The document was 4 pages and contained the results of the spectrographic analysis confirming that the aluminum alloy composition and surface finishing characteristics were consistent with Zagato coachwork, as documented in the 1961 production records. A comparison between physical measurements and the original Newport Pagnell build drawings showing correspondence within acceptable tolerance on all 37 measured points, a transcribed and witnessed statement from Arthur Whitfield, attesting to his personal involvement in the fabrication of specific panels, and a formal conclusion from the Heritage Trust that the vehicle in question was, with a degree of certainty, the document described as unambiguous, the Aston Martin DB4GT Zagato, bearing chassis designation 0180, manufactured in 1961. One of 19 examples produced and last documented in the official registry in 1974. It was the only one of the 19 whose ownership was currently unaccounted for in the living world. Darius read the document through twice at his kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him. Then he put his phone down and sat in the silence of his apartment for 20 minutes and thought about a Saturday morning in 1999 when he was 12 years old and his father had taken his hand on the production floor and pressed it against a curved aluminum panel and told him to feel the difference between what a machine makes and what a person makes. He had felt it then. He had felt it again in this garage 14 days ago at 11 o'clock at night, with the halogen lights burning and Imani asleep on her cot. He understood that those two moments were not separate. On the morning of the 14th day, Darius called Bonham's London. He did not call Sterling Prestige Auctions. He did not call any of the brokers who had left messages. He called Bonham's because they had handled the last verified DB4 GT Zagato to reach the open market 12 years prior, and they had done it with the exactness and seriousness that a car of this standing required. The representative he spoke with had been given Darius's name by Catherine Halloway and was ready for the call. Darius sent the full Heritage Trust certification along with his complete documentation package while they were still on the phone. The representative was quiet for a moment after confirming receipt and then told Darius that based on current market precedent for verified DB4 GT Zagatos in comparable or lesser condition, a conservative auction estimate would open at $8 million with the expectation that interest at the current level would drive the final figure considerably higher. Darius said he did not want to auction it. The representative asked him to clarify. Darius said he wanted to sell it directly and he wanted to know who the most serious institutional buyer was for this specific car. The representative named 3 parties. Darius asked about the third, a private automotive museum in Sedona, Arizona, that had been systematically acquiring verified DB4 GT Zagatos for 11 years and currently held 17 of the 19. Darius asked one question: did the museum display their collection publicly, or was it a private holding? The representative confirmed that a public institution open to the public year-round with educational programs for secondary schools and technical colleges. Darius said to make the call. The museum's acquisition director flew to Albany on a direct flight the same afternoon. He arrived at the garage at 6:15 in the evening, wearing a pale linen jacket despite the March temperature, and he walked slowly around the car twice without touching it, and then he stood still and looked at the firewall for a long time. He was not performing expertise, he simply knew what he was seeing and was allowing himself to see it fully. He told Darius they would pay $10 million bank transfer within 72 hours. Car to be transported under full insurance to Sedona within 30 days. Darius said he had one condition. The director asked what it was. Darius said the information panel beside the car in the museum must carry prominently and permanently the name of the craftsman who shaped the body panels. Arthur Whitfield, Newport Pagnell, 1961. The director looked at Darius for a moment, then said, "Of course." Darius shook his hand. Tyler, who had been standing near the wall with his arms crossed for the entirety of the conversation, let out a long breath and looked at the floor. The director left to call his board. Tyler looked at Darius and opened his mouth and closed it again, and then just nodded slowly, which was the most complete thing he could think of to say. The contract was signed the following morning. Arthur Whitfield, who had been sleeping in the apartment above the garage on a cot beside Imani's bookshelf for 3 days, stood up carefully when Darius told him and walked to the car and placed both of his hands flat against the rear quarter panel. His hands had begun to shake slightly in the past decade, not from age exactly, but from the accumulated weight of 40 years of hammer work, which leaves its own record in the body. He pressed his palms against the aluminum he had shaped 63 years ago and closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, he told the car it was going somewhere people would see it properly, and that it had deserved that for a long time. Imani was standing beside him, and she took his hand the way she took the hands of people she sensed were carrying something heavy, and held it without saying anything. Arthur looked down at her and then back at the car, and then he said, "The things we make with our hands don't disappear. They just wait for someone to find them again." Darius stood across the garage and listened and said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. Arthur Whitfield flew back to Coventry 4 days later. Darius drove him to the airport. At the departure gate, the old man paused and looked back once and told Darius he was very much like his father. Then he went through the security checkpoint, and Darius stood and watched until he was no longer visible, and then he drove back to the garage on the south end of the city and unlocked the door and turned on the halogen lights and stood in the empty center of the bay where the car had been. The floor still held the ghost of its presence, a patch of concrete slightly less abraded than the surrounding area, a faint residual of aluminum dust near the drain, a few precise marks where the rolling dolly had pressed against the sealant. Tyler took down the video he had posted within 72 hours of putting it up, saying only that it had done what it needed to do. Margaret Sterling, in the weeks that followed, formally terminated her arrangement with Gregory Holcomb and issued an internal directive requiring that all consigned vehicles be assessed in person before any lot description was finalized. She did this without public announcement and without referencing the specific event that had prompted it. Lawrence Whitmore did not comment publicly. He was not a man who found it easy to discuss the occasions when his judgment had failed him, and this was by almost any calculation the most expensive such occasion of his life. He had been 3 feet from 0180. He had spent 30 seconds looking at it. He had shaken his head. 3 weeks after the sale, the garage on the south end of Albany looked the way it always had. Darius still worked in flannel. He still took the same kinds of jobs. Oil changes, brake jobs, the occasional classic car that needed careful attention that had been the steady business of the shop since he opened it. He added one full-time employee because Tyler had been splitting his time between 2 shops for 3 years, and it was time to stop pretending that was a permanent arrangement. He paid off the remainder of the equipment loan he had taken out in the shop's 2nd year. He established a small scholarship fund through the Albany Technical College in his wife Naomi's name specifically for the children of working mechanics and tradespeople who wanted to study automotive technology, with a quiet preference written into the application materials in language gentle enough that nobody could call it preferential for first-generation students from neighborhoods like the one he had set up his shop in. When Arthur Whitfield returned Darius's financial contribution with a handwritten note asking him to keep it for Imani's education, Darius put the note in the same wooden box where he kept his father's letters, and he put the money in the education fund instead, and he did not explain this decision to anyone. On a Friday evening, he and Imani ate dinner at the small kitchen table above the garage, her rabbit occupying the 4th chair as it always did. Imani asked where the car had gone. Darius told her it was in Arizona, in a room with windows where people came to look at it. She asked if it was happy. He thought about Arthur's hands on the aluminum and about a Saturday morning in 1999 and about a paper envelope with $200 in it, and he told her he thought it probably was that it had been waiting to be seen properly for a very long time, and now it was. Imani absorbed this and returned to her food. After a while, she looked up at him and asked how he had known to buy it. He said he had looked more carefully than the other people in the room. She asked why he looked more carefully. He put down his fork and thought about that for a moment, because it was the kind of question that deserved more than a quick answer. Then he said, "Some things, if you don't look for them, nobody will." After dinner, Darius went back down to the garage alone. He turned on the halogen lights out of habit, even though there was no car under them worth that quality of light at that moment. Just a 1989 Toyota pickup waiting for a belt replacement and a small collection of disassembled carburetor parts laid out on a clean cloth. He stood in the center of the bay in the space where 0180 had been and looked at nothing in particular for a while. He thought about the arithmetic of the whole thing, not the money but the structure of it. $200 on a Monday morning, and the moment 14 days later when a man from Arizona had said $10 million without flinching, and all the space in between that had been filled with work and knowledge and the kind of attention that most people in that Albany auction room had spent their careers training themselves not to waste on things that looked like nothing. He was not a person who thought much about irony or lesson or the kind of narrative neatness that a story like this seemed to offer. He thought about what he knew about aluminum and what his father had taught him, and what Arthur's hands remembered, and what Imani had said from the back seat on the way to Albany at 5 o'clock in the morning. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. He turned off the halogen lights. He locked the door. He went upstairs. The garage was quiet. 72 people were in that room on a Monday morning in March. All of them had seen the car. Not one of them had looked at it. That is not a story about luck, and it is not a story about money. It is a story about what it costs to stop and measure and ask the right question and not walk past the thing in front of you simply because it does not look at first like what it is. Arthur Whitfield shaped that aluminum in 1961 with blistered hands and left a mark in the metal that 63 years of time and 3 years of fire could not remove. A 29-year-old man in a flannel shirt found it because he had been taught by his father by his years, by the accumulation of all the attention he had ever paid to things the world had decided were not worth paying attention to. How to see it. $200, 14 days, $10 million, but more than any of those numbers, one question asked in the right silence, in the right light, by the right set of hands. What is this really? Everything else followed from that. And if any part of this story stays with you after the lights go off, let it be this. There are people in your life right now, and possibly there is a version of yourself that the room has already decided about. The world is fast, and the catalog descriptions it writes are short. But the things worth finding in cars and in people almost never announce themselves at first glance. They wait. They wait for someone patient enough to bring a soft brush and a steady light, and to ask without hurry, what is this really? May you be that kind of looker, and when your own turn comes, may you be lucky enough to be looked at that way too.